Good evening and welcome to the fourth and final Talking History event for 2025. My name is Mandy Paul. I'm Head of Collections at the History Trust of South Australia and I'll be your chair this evening. Namani. Nadalu Tampundi. Nadalu Ghana Yartanga. Tikanthi. These Ghana words acknowledge that we're sitting on Ghana land tonight, unceded Ghana country. I pay my respects to Ghana people, ancestors past and present, and their continuing connection to, and relevantly for this evening, knowledge of the country. Talking History is one of the many offerings delivered by the History Trust of South Australia. The program is now well over a decade old, and it exists to bring people together to talk history, specifically South Australian history. And in addition to the History Festival, which I'm sure you all know about and runs for the whole month of May, the History Trust stewards the annual Beta Birdwood Car Rally, which is coming up on the 19th of October, and manages our three museums: the Migration Museum, the Maritime Museum, and the National Motor Museum, as well as the gallery, the Centre of Democracy, which is just down the hall in the Institute building. The History Trust also delivers a range of other initiatives in education, digital outreach, and we manage the State History Collection on your behalf. Tonight's Talking History is part of the Nature Festival, a festival now in its 6th year. The Nature Festival is a growing movement of over 200 partners dedicated to celebrating South Australia's love of nature and reminding us of the well-being that a deeper connection to nature can offer. So the history we're talking tonight is environmental history, an area of particular interest to me. And while this topic was scheduled a long time ago to align with the Nature Festival, somehow it's been supercharged with relevance over the last months and weeks as we grapple with the ongoing algal bloom and come to terms with what lies ahead, as laid out in the recently released Australian National Climate Risk Assessment. This year's Talking History also involves a partnership with the State Library of South Australia, who are generously hosting us here this evening in the Hetzel Room. And just before we get going, some housekeeping. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the directions of security staff. If you need the bathroom, there's one downstairs and there's an accessible bathroom just through the doors and to the left. So the format for this evening, I'll introduce each panellist who'll speak for 15 minutes. And once all our speakers have concluded, we'll sit up here and I'll ask a couple of questions to get us going, and then we'll hand over to the audience to ask some questions. We need to wrap up by 8 o'clock, so I'll give the speakers a 5-minute warning, and I might also institute a practice of just one question per audience member. We'll see how we go with how many people are out to speak. So without more ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Lauren Fuge. And the title of Lauren's talk is What the Land Remembers, Exploring Environmental Memories in Literature. So I'll tell you a little bit about each speaker and then I'll just give you a tiny snippet that'll be a taster for what they're going to talk about. So Lauren's a writer who lives and works on Ghana country. Her book, Voyages, Our Journey into the Anthropocene, was published by Text in 2024. She's currently undertaking a PhD exploring storytelling and the climate crisis, as well as organising with grassroots community and climate groups. She previously worked as a science journalist and editor at Cosmos. She won the 2023 AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Awards in the magazine category and the 2022 University of New South Wales Bragg Prize for Science Writing. And she's going to talk this evening, she's going to explore for us how writers can draw on environmental memories to expand the limits of literature, using the Flinders Ranges Adnyamat Hoyata as an example.
next slide from there, please.
Could be, that's it. Perfect. Thank you, Mandy. Whoa. Nā everyone. I would also like to start by acknowledging that we are meeting here tonight on the stolen lands of the Kaurna people. I want to acknowledge that they have cared for this country for more than 60,000 years and that they have showed incredible strength in withstanding more than 320 years of colonisation, which continues to this day. Our acknowledgements must not be simply symbolic, but must be paired with a commitment to decolonisation and solidarity with First Nations resistance here and everywhere. So as you've already heard from the lovely Mandy, my name is Lauren Fuge. I'm a writer, an activist and a PhD student, and I'm here to talk to you guys tonight about my writing work as a South Australian interested in the links between storytelling and the land. So for a bit of context, as Mandy also said, last year I released a book called Voyages, which is a non-fiction book blending science, history and memoir to explore the journey of the human species from the deep past to the dangerous precipice of the Anthropocene, where we are today, where we've become the dominant influence on planetary systems. And in several chapters of the book, I draw deeply on South Australian history, including our deep time history. One of the challenges to writers and artists right now whose work deals with the climate crisis is both confronting the scale of it and finding ways of making sense of its complexity and interconnectedness. As the Australian writer James Bradley says, we need stories that capture and interrogate the meanings of a profoundly altered world, including by moving outside of an isolated human frame of reference. So something I'm really interested in my writing and in my research as a PhD student is how to write by drawing on memories beyond the human sphere. And just as our own minds hold memories, the land holds memories too, from tree rings to geological strata, ice cores to corals, even the ear bones of fish to fossilized pollen. And in a time now of rapid climate and ecological change, the stories that these memories of the land can tell us are more important than ever. So tonight I'm going to be exploring very briefly these environmental memories using Adnyamatniyata or the Flinders Ranges as an example. As you can see up there in my photo, this is the Aruna Valley. So to start with, let's talk a little bit about memoir as a literary genre that deals with memory. So as I wrote my book that was released last year, Voyages, I kind of became an accidental memoirist. I was telling this enormous story of human history and the climate crisis, but I quickly realized that I needed a far more grounded and personal story as part of that, to sort of anchor the reader through that enormous story. So I incorporated memoir that reflected on my own sort of difficult path of coming to terms with the climate crisis as a young person. So memoir is a type of autobiography, but instead of covering a whole lifespan chronologically, it dwells on certain moments or experiences and maps their interconnections. A writer of memoir works hard to engage with their experiences and make a larger sense of what happened. And part of this work is done through the act of remembering. The term memoir derives from the French word for memory, and the genre draws on the archival material of the writer's own mind. And I've been interested in using memoir to explore and make meaning specifically of our rapidly changing world. Our knowledge systems are becoming fragmented and disconnected, and things are changing around us at rates and scales that we've never before experienced. Stories that help us remember, find connections, and engage deeply are needed more than ever. And I'm particularly interested in a subgenre of memoir called eco-memoir. So traditionally, memoir has by definition had human life at its core, but humans have always been intimately bound up with millions of other beings, as non-Western and Indigenous storytelling has long recognised. In recent years, this subgenre of eco-memoir has emerged, expanding our minds outwards to the other lives that exist alongside us and that we can't live without, like fungi, bacteria, orchids, even things like rocks and rivers and mountains. Eco-memoir tells stories through a relational worldview, so it positions humans within a broad spectrum of matter and life in both present and deep time. The use of memory is key in eco-memoir to recall and make sense of a writer's experience in the natural world. But writers can also tap into the wisdom of the land itself, the memories held in its plants, animals, and elemental beings. This is something that I started to explore in my writing. So what emerges if we listen to what the land could tell us? If we could turn terrain into text, geography into consciousness? So I'll give you some examples. I've written a lot about Adnyamatniyata, or the Flinders Ranges, and I've made many trips north. I've spent many months up there. And part of what continues to draw me there is what I think of as the thinness of time up in those ancient mountains, how millions of years of geological and biological history can be read in the rocks. It was there that I really began to think about what the land itself remembers and began wondering how interacting with those memories and connecting them, as memoir does, can teach us more than what we as humans know alone. So, what kind of memories am I talking about? The most obvious one in the Flinders is the geology, and what this tells us about the vastly different worlds that came before us. It's a place of deep time, where ancient rocks are exposed and tell histories reaching back 1 billion years or more. If you know how to read them, you can see stories of jagged mountains, glacial epochs, inland seas, and more. I'm going to read a short excerpt from my book now, from chapter 5, where I visit a significant geological site in the Flinders and I reach back through time. Some of you might know what this is. There is a place in the Flinders Ranges that marks the beginning of the world as we know it. In the shade of a river red gum in Enorama Creek, a bronze-coloured disc is embedded in the rock at the divide between slabs of purple tillite and sandy dolomite. Colloquially known as golden spikes, these discs are geological waypoints, precisely placed at stark changes in the rock strata, representing transitions between ages. They are records of cataclysms and proliferations, of makings and unmakings, proof of an Earth history too vast to even capture its shape in my mind. When I found this dull, scratched disc one warm August morning, it seemed deceptively modest for a monument at the delineation of two worlds, only about the size of my palm. I sank cross-legged onto the sun-warmed tillite and lifted my hand to the dusty metal. Time suddenly scrunched up beneath me, and for an instant I was connected to one of the most crucial climate shifts in history, when complex life first burst into being. 700 million years ago, glaciers gripped the Earth from pole to equator in the most intense ice age the planet has ever seen. Where I sat in the creek bed, present-day North America was ripping away from the Australian continent in the breakup of the supercontinent Rodinia, opening a rift valley. This flooded to become a sea, and when the glaciers retreated and the world abruptly warmed again, life made the leap from single cells to multicellular. The waters of this inland sea soon squirmed and slithered with the first complex life as we know it, the Ediacarans. Their soft bodies squelched over sediments that would eventually compress into rock, that as the sea dried up would sink and fold and lift again in the great machinations of this planet's crust, until I stood on their dredged-up peaks atop nearly 1 billion years of history. Today, the ranges have been twisted, buckled, and eroded so thoroughly that layers run vertically through the mountains. Years have made unparalleled weapons of wind and rain, slicing through the rock to expose a more ancient time beneath. In some areas of the Flinders, you can travel a couple dozen kilometres and pass through hundreds of millions of years. Time is thin here. The eons slip in and out of each other. And that's lovely. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
So next, to think about other memories that are in the Flinders, of course, one of the very obvious ones up there are the fossils. So fossils are almost quite literally memories. They, as I said in the previous section, they date back to the very earliest animals on Earth, 600 or so million years ago. Fossils from this period up in the Flinders are often captured in these massive golden sandstone slabs, some that are still rippled from waves from that inland sea. that are literally snapshots of entire marine communities formed when storms buried ecosystems in the sand. These slabs are marked with strange imprints of creatures, like on the left-hand side there, whose soft bodies long ago rotted away. The rocks there are literally remembering a time when they held an animal. The Flinders also holds memories on a shorter time scale. So there are the creek beds that even when dry, very clearly still show how water flowed through them in other seasons, and even other years, going back millennia. The recent rains are evident in the shapes of the stones and silt and debris, in the deep wells gouged out around tree trunks, and long ago water is visible in the formation of gorges. There are also the tracks and trails that detail animal movements and human occupation over time. There are marks of colonization, roads, the changing makeup of ecosystems and the diversity of plant life, the hoof prints of goats and sheep and cattle and camels that now press into the earth. All of these are kinds of memories. There are also the trees, which actively record the changes in their environment in their own bodies with each new layer of wood that they put on year after year. Tree rings can provide snapshots of past climate conditions and evidence of floods, drought, insect attacks, lightning strikes, even earthquakes. And then beyond the Flinders, there are many, many more ways that the land can hold memories. For example, as I said earlier, things like coral and the ear bones of fish build traces of their environmental conditions into themselves each year like tree rings do. And there are ice cores too. These cylinders of ice are drilled out of ice sheets, which are the accumulation of millions of seasons of snowfall that freeze into cold pressurized slabs several kilometers thick. And as each layer of that ice forms, it traps air pockets, which become fossilized breaths of the atmosphere, as well as trapping tiny particles like dust, pollen, ash, and trace elements. The ice therefore contains physical memories of the land over hundreds of thousands of years, and all of those years are held in the ice together, all times alive here in the now. Learning to read these memories, to read the knowledge held by the continent and its beings, can contextualize the changes that we are making to the Earth's vital systems and offer us glimpses of possible futures. We are now on the precipice of ecological collapse, and part of addressing this and surviving this means changing the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and who we are becoming. In my opinion, many of our major problems stem from a pull away from the natural world, a sense of separation that allows us to treat the earth as a resource to be pillaged infinitely for profit. But we are the earth, and we have to come back into right relationship with it to find our way through this frankly terrifying time. One of the ways we can do this is by paying attention to the more than human world, to learn to listen to these other voices and expand our stories to encompass them. The memories in the land that I've talked about tonight, so the geological strata, the ice, the fossils, the tree rings, can expand our stories to reflect the tangled web of relationships inherent in the natural world and remind us of our belonging to the earth and our influence over it. They can also compel us to remember what it took to build the present we are currently dismantling by offering other perspectives. The writer Joni Adamson calls non-human beings in literature seeing instruments. Their presence allows readers to experience spans of time and planetary change that are otherwise invisible to our senses and to our relatively short lives. Rocks and ice cores and trees help us become time travelers. They can give us glimpses of possibilities beyond our current reality, which we desperately need in order to radically reimagine how we live. In my research and my writing, I'm also interested in what will be lost as the physical world transforms, as ice sheets melt, as seas rise to cover the land, as things like archaeological sites are disturbed. How will the planet's current memories degrade, morph, or vanish? And how will that affect the stories we're able to tell? And as thousands of species are driven to extinction by human actions, as we approach a time of absence when they exist only as memory, will we still tell their stories? That's something that I want to explore next. But for tonight, I think I have to finish here with more questions than answers. So if you liked any of what I was talking about or reading tonight, this is my shameless plug for my book, which came out last year. You'll find it in most bookstores. You'll find it in Dymocks and Dillon's. It's called Voyages, Our Journey into the Anthropocene. But yeah, thank you guys so much for having me tonight. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Lauren. That was fabulous. Wonderful.
Stole this. You cannot remember Mandy might need that. Or just change your brain.
Thanks. I'll just give you a minute to settle. Just kind of take that in. So our next speaker this evening is Amanda Wells. Amanda's an environmental historian whose research explores the intersections of agriculture, ecology and settler colonial placemaking in 20th century Australia. She recently completed her PhD at the University of Newcastle, examining the more than human history, and we're hearing about more than human this evening. We might come back and talk about that. The more than human history of South Australia's riverland during the 1950s and 60s, with a focus on the citrus industry's role in shaping regional identity and economy. And last year I saw Amanda give a fabulous paper about, well, I would not live. Are you going to talk about the queens? No? No, about citrus queens. You can ask her if you're curious. So Amanda's work draws on environmental history, historical geography, and the environmental humanities to illuminate the relationships between people, non-human species, and landscapes. Amanda's published and presented nationally and internationally on topics including pest control, agricultural modernisation, and rural settlement schemes. She's an active member of several history organisations and works for the History Council of New South Wales, Barossa Regional University Campus, and the University of Newcastle. Her broader research interests include transnational environmental histories, histories of science and tech, and the cultural and ecological dimensions of agricultural production. So this evening, Amanda's going to talk with us about South Australia's riverland, when it was a centre of citrus production, and exploring the more than human environmental history of the transformation of that place, tracing the relationships between people, orange trees, soils, water, animals, and climate. Please welcome Amanda.
Okay.
Well, thank you everyone for being here, and I'd also like to echo the acknowledgement of country and add that the research for my PhD, which forms the basis of the work that I'm talking about tonight, was conducted on and about Murray country along the River Murray from approximately the state border, where it curves dramatically south at Morgan. I've got a couple of pictures here that I stole from an earlier presentation just to demonstrate that, and I like the map there that shows how sort of porous these borders are. And I'd like to thank, in particular, Mary Elder Uncle Eric Cook for his advice early on in how to speak about Arrarung country, in particular where Renmark sits today, and a lot of my research comes from. So as the title of my talk suggests, the research that I've been conducting over the past 4 years has been about the environmental history of the Riverland. I set out to investigate the history of citrus growing in the Riverland in the 1950s and 1960s, in part to understand what it was my grandfather, Roger Wells, was doing there in the post-war years. There had been research done on the grape and wine industries in South Australia, on wheat and on wool, but there hadn't been anything on citrus, and certainly not on Riverland citrus specifically. So I wanted to look closely at the questions of why citrus, why the Riverland, and all the accompanying questions on how this industry shaped the Riverland we know today, and how the Riverland shaped the citrus industry in turn. Early on, I found I actually had quite a neat answer to the question of the close relationship between the Riverland and the citrus industry. I found that the name Riverland itself was originally a citrus brand name created in the 1930s by the Murray Citrus Growers Cooperative Association. It was a brand name that drew upon the example of the Californian sun-kissed brand, seeking to sell an idea of place along with the produce. Prior to the more general acceptance of the word Riverland to describe the region, the South Australian districts between Renmark and Blanchetown were not really described as a cohesive region. They didn't have a unified place identity. The more upstream districts were sometimes simply called the South Australian Upper Murray or just the Upper Murray, a name that was understandably a little confusing to visitors from out of state who might know that the true Upper Murray was actually over 1,000 kilometres east and upstream. And some examples of confusion from the newspapers I put on the screen there. So I felt certain that my research exploring the relationship between place, industry and people was on the right track, if Riverland for citrus eventually became Riverland for region. Another early discovery gives context for how the citrus industry cemented its place as so influential as to play a role in renaming the region. Between 1948 and 1970, the area planted with citrus in South Australia more than doubled, with most of that being concentrated in what we now know as the Riverland. Prior to the expansion of citrus plantings in the post-war era, citrus was an important crop, no doubt, but it was part of a mix, largely consisting also of grapevines and stone fruits. Dried fruit was a particularly important industry in this region, just as it was across the border in Renmark's sister city Mildura and related districts. But following World War II, the South Australian government, encouraged by local advocates, sought to expand irrigation areas by establishing new soldier settlements. In response to some of the failures of the World War I soldier settlements, and with some new scientific tools available, detailed soil surveys were undertaken which helped to identify which areas and which soils were prime for certain identified crops. The result of this at places like Coultong and Loxton was that large areas of land were identified as ideal for citrus. But it wasn't just government-led expansions, however. There were also private investments made across the region and in places such as Sunlands and Ramco. These new expansions built upon the solid foundations of decades prior, where irrigation farming had been established as central to the development of the river districts. Beginning with Renmark in 1887, the infrastructure of towns, roads, wharves and rail was all established to facilitate the successful production of citrus and its horticultural cousins, delivered to the domestic and international markets. Pumps, channels and pipes delivered the River Murray's water to the sandy soils, usually out of reach of the river's flow. The high number of sunny days in the region could be taken advantage of to fuel the growth of trees and dry fruits in the direct sunlight, all the while relying on water falling upstream and not clouding riverland skies. It's worth noting too that the fruit industries in the Riverland established at Renmark in the late 19th century had strong Californian connections. The Chaffey brothers had been invited to Australia by Victorian MP Alfred Deakin after he met and toured their settlements in California, and it was the Chaffeys who established both Renmark and Mildura. The Californian connection is not just an interesting factoid, as demonstrated by the influence of Sunkist on the Murray citrus growers' naming of their brand of oranges. South Australian and Californian citrus promotion had much in common. Both were drawing on the long-standing cultural symbolism of citrus fruits, and fruits in general, as vital, abundant, and the products of nature. Both also drew on the history of citrus within the British Empire as having been an exotic fruit that could not be easily cultivated in the British Isles, and thus only appearing in the richest of fruit bowls. And I've added a side note here for a resource I found fairly recently on Californian citrus, where they described their essays and exhibitions as pulp non-fiction, which I thought was very cool and something we can aspire to in South Australian history. Citrus also has the advantage of being closely tied to modern science in at least two ways. Firstly, there's the familiar story of the discovery that citrus fruits were a cure to scurvy, an important finding for the British Empire, which was so wide-flung that travel across the Dominion necessitated months at sea. The reason that citrus was effective in combating scurvy was not framed in terms of vitamins or vitamin C until the 20th century, but even so, the discovery of this cure for such a problematic ailment bolstered the reputation of citrus fruits in the empire. Secondly, American involvement in the development of the modern citrus industry and modern citrus fruits drew heavily on science and genetics. You may know that California was once the global hub of citrus, and it was at the time that my research was undertaken as well, and that places in greater Los Angeles were once citrus groves, hence, for example, Orange County. And if you're familiar with Los Angeles, you may have heard of a place called Burbank. And this is named after Luther Burbank, who, among many things, was famously involved in the development of citrus fruits in the late 19th and early 20th century. So ideas around citrus in South Australia had a deep well to draw upon. Orchards in general, not just citrus orchards, have an advantage in appealing to modern Western senses of order and modernity. Orchards tend towards landscapes of order, straight rows of trees closely observed. Orchards tend, long channels with controlled valves and systems for measuring and delivering water. And orchards have the advantage of having been associated with more gentlemanly forms of agriculture than some dryland farming. Orchards tended to be overseen by men who could afford to plant their trees and then wait for years for them to return a profit, unlike annual crops like wheat, where each year required sowing and harvesting afresh. And so it's this history, in combination with the rapidly changing world of science and technology into the modern world of the post-war period, that informs how the Riverland emerged as a place that could rise on the back of citrus production. But it was not all sunshine and harvests. My research covers the period 1948 to 1970, and you might know that there are two major environmental events in that period that do not bode well for agriculture conducted along a notoriously messy but mighty river. Firstly, the 1956 floods, and secondly, the 1965 to 1968 drought. Viewing these two events through the lens of citrus production led me to understand the broad-ranging consequences of irrigation agriculture quite differently. We all know that agriculture is successful only when human intervention in nature aligns with the whims of climate and broader ecologies. A key outcome of both the 1956 floods and the mid-1960s drought was the highlighting of salinity as a problem for riverland growers. Salinity, unfortunately, is a problem of both too much water and not enough water. The 1956 flood, although slow in comparison to the dramatic flash floods we sometimes see in other parts of Australia and the world, was a moment in which riverlanders and their neighbours upstream and downstream could unite to tackle a crisis. But the long fallout from that flood was where salinity problems emerged or exacerbated as the water table was dramatically changed. Some orchards could not recover. The orangery at Chowler Homestead, for example, was completely inundated, and none of those trees survived. It's now planted with vines. Other trees escaped flooding, but the water table was so changed in some places that previously hardy trees experienced distress or died as a result. The 1965 to 68 drought, as all droughts tend to be, was less dramatic in its beginnings, but by 1966 it was apparent to people across the basin and the southeast of the continent in general that a severe drought was in place. For growers relying on the River Murray, this meant that less fresh water was entering the river upstream, and thus as the river flowed west and south, it picked up minerals including salts and became more and more saline. Compounding the issue was upstream growers' runoff also being added back into the stream, where that water had picked up content from the land, including more salts, from the water table. By the time water reached the South Australian border, it was measuring at dangerous levels. The crises of flood and drought did not just bring damage. They exerted pressure to modernise. Growers and governments alike saw in these events not only ecological warning signs, but also opportunities to refine, improve, and expand the infrastructure of irrigation. The 1956 flood showed the vulnerability of low-lying groves, but it also prompted renewed investment in levees, pumping stations, and coordinated regional planning. In the drought years, when salinity crept higher, the response was not to step back from irrigation agriculture, but to double down. To imagine that more science, more control, more intervention could contain could contain the volatility of the river system. In this way, environmental stresses reinforced a culture of innovation. Farmers became experimenters as much as cultivators, adopting new irrigation techniques, trialling fertilisers and embracing chemical regimes that promised to keep their trees productive. Agricultural departments issued bulletins, hosted field days, and offered the reassurance that with the right tools, even floods and droughts could be managed. But beneath this optimism lay the reality that each intervention generated new risks, from chemical residues in soil to rising groundwater. The Riverland citrus landscapes became both showcases of progress and laboratories of uncertainty. The push to innovate was never a purely local story. Riverland citrus growing was entangled in wider networks of exchange and agricultural modernisation. South Australian agronomists read American bulletins and borrowed from Californian and other places experiments. Growers themselves compared notes with counterparts across the border in Mildura or further afield in citrus districts in New South Wales and Queensland and Western Australia. Pest eradication campaigns drew on international models, including sterile insect technique programs pioneered both overseas and in Adelaide. This transnational traffic of knowledge underscored that the Riverland was not an isolated frontier, but part of a global citrus world. Its growers were heirs to Californian promotional strategies, British imperial histories of citrus and scurvy, and post-war international science that positioned agriculture as a tool of development and prosperity. South Australian research officers conducted overseas research tours, visiting California, Texas, Israel, and many Southeast Asian countries to confer on salinity, pests and diseases, as well as irrigation and marketing innovations. What emerged in the Riverland was therefore hybrid. Local practices adapted to sandy soils and murray waters, but were shaped by flows of information, capital, and cultural imagery across oceans. By the 1960s, environmental crisis and political ambition converged in debates over water policy. The proposed Chowla Dam loomed large. Framed as a means of guaranteeing South Australia's water security, it promised to stabilise irrigation supply for citrus and other crops. For many Riverland growers, the dam symbolised a future of certainty, water stored, measured, released on demand. Yet the dam was also deeply contested. Critics warned of the economic and ecological consequences, and rising salinity levels made some question whether it would in fact solve the problems it was meant to address. These debates revealed that water in the Riverland was never simply a resource, but a contested political terrain. Entitlements were bargained over, flows measured, rights asserted and defended. Citrus growers, through cooperatives and lobbying bodies, played a vocal role in pressing their claims. The fate of Chowla, eventually abandoned for Dartmouth, reflected the growing recognition that water politics could not be settled within state borders. And it was a reminder that Riverland citrus was enmeshed in the basin-wide hydrology of the Murray-Darling, dependent on rainfall in Queensland and snowmelt in the Alps as much as on pumps at Renmark and Loxton. From these decades of expansion and crisis emerged strategies that would shape citrus growing in South Australia and indeed across the nation for generations. Stabilisation schemes modelled on wheat promised growers a measure of protection from the vagaries of global markets. Coordinated pest campaigns demonstrated the power and the perils of chemical control. Irrigation authorities experimented with efficiency measures, while growers adapted block layouts, windbreaks and varietal choices to cope with new challenges. And these strategies were not always successful, but they illustrate the enduring entanglement of citrus with science, policy and environment. The Riverland became a crucible where modern agriculture was tested, sometimes triumphantly, sometimes with unintended consequences. In these orchards, optimism and anxiety grew side by side. So when we say Riverland, we're invoking more than a geography of the Murray's banks. We're invoking a history of naming, branding and imagining, a history in which citrus was both crop and symbol. The Riverland as a place emerged from rows of citrus trees planted in sandy soils, from pipes and channels carrying river water, from the labour of settlers and migrants, and from the more than human agencies of trees, soils, pests and climate. It also emerged from stories of abundance, sunshine, health and vitality, And these were stories told in advertising and festivals, including the Citrus Queens that Mandy mentioned, but also lived in the everyday practices of pruning, irrigating and harvesting. They were stories reinforced by science and policy and by the constant search for control over a landscape that remained both generous and volatile. For the Riverland, citrus was never just an economic crop. It was a way of seeing and being in place, a way of imagining a future of order and prosperity. And while the orchards themselves have waxed and waned, the idea of the Riverland as a sunny, abundant and productive place has endured, a testament to how landscapes and identities are made together. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Another fabulous paper, lots to think about. I think we're going to have fun talking later. So our final speaker for this evening is Faith Coleman, and the title of her talk is Why Our Environmental Histories Matter to Our Shared Future. Faith is a multi-generational ecologist working predominantly we're going to talk a lot about salt this evening, wet, salty, muddy, often smelly habitats that form the productive edges of our land, aquifers, rivers and sea, saline lakes, salinas, is that how you pronounce that?
Yeah.
Salinas, estuaries and coastal lagoons. The microbiology, biochemistry and primary productivity of these zones is critical to salt production, fisheries productivity and water quality, as well as cultural and environmental values such as shorebirds, physical manifestations of cultural stories, and providing thin places where people can connect with culture. Faith sits on the boards of several science-based organisations, including the International Society for Salt Lake Research and the Coorong Environmental Trust. And this evening, she's going to tell us something about some of the things that she's found in the collection here at the State Library and how that has shed light on the ecology and management of the lakes and the Coorong and how this might inform wetlands' future and how it might be helpful in other coastal environmental challenges.
Over to you, Pat.
Okay, I'm here tonight to speak about why our environmental histories, represented within the archives of our institutions, are critical to finding the best way forward in the face of climate change. It seems a strange thing to spend time looking back into the past when our current world is in so much turmoil and need of attention. This is particularly evident along the South Australian coast and marine zone, as well as the estuaries and coastal lagoons across the entire coastline of southern Australia. These highly productive zones, once the richest of fisheries, nurseries, sequesters of carbon, home to shorebirds and wild game, are often now bacterial pea soups, enough to make a biolab blush. These disasters don't just suddenly happen, even though they appear so to the casual observer. Ecological collapse sneaks up on us, often over decades or centuries, eroding the foundations of ecological services we depend on until they collapse. The challenge we currently face in our marine zones often have clear links to events in the 19th century. Over time, we have maximised the utility of landscapes, often completely missing what's going on under the water. We modify the flow patterns and the ionic composition of our waters, we reduce wetland areas, we change hydro periods and modify the gaseous composition of the air. Through these processes, the erosion of ecological complexity and therefore the resilience of our landscapes and seascapes sneak up on us unheralded. We have forgotten the aquatic wonderlands we originally colonised, a rapid version of the intergenerational shifting baseline originally coined across many centuries of change in seascapes with longer colonial histories. Our nearshore, inland and estuarine fisheries are all a fraction of what they once were. Accounts of the skies turning black with ducks and swans are thought to be fairy tales, as dinoflagellate and cyanobacterial blooms plague our shores. Most notably started here by Heidi Alloway in 2014, there are now a whole suite of South Australian environmental historians or historical ecologists, including myself, stitching together historic records to determine what the South Australian coast and marine zone once looked like, hoping this will help us understand the present environment while guiding us towards restoring the functionality of seascapes past. Given how hard the Anthropocene has bitten into the well-being of this planet, it seems pure folly to think that we might possibly restore or go back to the future, yet I contend the opposite. There is no time like the present to look for solutions in our past. Picking through historic descriptions of our coastal wetlands and marine zones, it is possible to see alternative ways of ecosystems functioning. Sharing these recreations with our communities helps us reset preconceived ideas of what our waterscapes are capable of producing, filtering, buffering, and sequestering. This process sows hope for the future and identifies tangible, pragmatic paths forward. It shows us what we've lost and reignites our passion to restore our connections to sea country. These are two South Australian examples, the latest iteration of the mapping of the lost shellfish reefs of Southern Australia, led by the Nature Conservatory, and my own work mapping the 1970s aquatic meadows and forests of the South Lagoon of the Coorong. While the creation of these simple maps was complex, utilising rich, diverse historic records sourced from a wide array of collections, my aim tonight is to show you how these two examples relate to the current marine dinoflagellate bloom, demonstrating how the knowledge gained from these historic recreations is contributing to finding solutions to one of the largest and most complex environmental issues in South Australian history. The work started by Heidi over a decade ago, documenting the records of the Angasi or native flat oyster dredging along a third of our coastline, has evolved into the start of a restoration program. This knowledge has been used by the Nature Conservancy to recreate several rock and shell-based reefs, most notably near Ardrossan and just offshore at Glenelg, which are both seeded with young oysters produced in hatcheries, as well as providing settling points for the wild spat we forgot we had. The footage here was taken of the Glenelg oyster reefs just a couple of years after their construction, but before the marine algae bloom reached Adelaide waters. There were at the time 100 young oysters per square metre, with each oyster filtering up to 100 litres of seawater a day. Visiting this site recently, much of this vegetation and animal life is now gone as a result of the bloom. However, the oysters, along with much of the seagrass, persists. Dissecting farmed oysters, it's evident that both the Pacific and native flat oysters are filtering out and consuming a vast number of our friend Carinia, along with the bacteria and phytoplankton that is blooming as a result of the rotting organic matter. What this shows is that while these restored areas are too small to make any measurable difference, these habitats, if restored at scale, would provide a powerful positive feedback loop, keeping our marine waters cleaner and cooler, reducing the risk of another dinoflagellate bloom, and if one started, this huge natural filtration system would reduce its severity and duration. Similar histories are present in the Coorong. The word cloud in the centre was generated from the pre-Federation historic accounts that I've collected over the past decade, summing some 2,500 pieces of documentation, relating to the green carpets or aquatic plants that existed in the South Lagoon of the Coorong prior to 1900. The three sepia images are more recent. They are from 1935 to 1969, showing the dense macrophyte beds that once existed in this area, along with up to 50,000 black swans that bred in the South Lagoon, and were entirely dependent on the Lanthothamnium or stonewort. The stonewort is fascinating. This species was once the dominant aquatic plant in the South Lagoon, but is now largely absent and almost completely forgotten by all but a few geologists. It has a worldwide distribution, but its loss across the majority of this range is now having significant impacts. The genus is the favourite food of our waterfowl. It sequesters calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate, which has a moderating effect on water quality. Its dense rhizoids form mats across soft sediments, allowing other plants to flourish, and it hosts a number of phytoplankton, consuming zooplankton. Research on this species in Siberia suggests that the spores of the algae remain viable for up to 800 years, just waiting for us to give it a chance. The colour photo is my youngest son swimming over a forest of stonewort, which naturally colonised and formed a 1 metre deep swathe in the base of a nearby man-created groundwater lake. We have absolutely no idea how it got there. Within the historic record of the Coorong, even water quality data can be pieced together. Even the obscure, such as in this case, the quantity of calcium carbonate dissolved in the water of the South Lagoon. It turns out somebody researched it, and that was in the Bar Smith. The data is scarce, however, it is there. Careful comparison of the methodologies used can enable comparison of the data, showing the simplification of water chemistry and the loss of calcium carbonate, and therefore its suitability to stonewort across the entire Coorong. It is then possible to get even more nerdy and create this amazing combination of modern and historic records, along with what we know of similar ecological systems, to produce these really complex water quality models. These show the various observations and changes and how they interrelate. Once prepared, it's possible to test them. Until we have a model like this, we can't test it, but once prepared, we can. And the creation would not have been possible without the extensive records kept within the historic collections of universities, state archives, the State Library, and digital versions such as Trove. This historic work can then be used to recreate the future. For the Coorong, the work I did carefully piecing its ecological history together is providing hope to the impacted communities, which you can see here, with a new wave of history and science-based advocacy occurring. With the visual aids of Coorong's past, we are able to inspire political will in a way that we've never been able to before. There is a group of us using history to make history. Like waves crashing on the shore, we believe we can use our ecological past to reshape our collective future. If we can restore the underwater forests of the Coorong and at least 40% of the lost oyster reefs of the Gulfs, we believe that we can turn back the clock, reinstating historic fisheries productivity, helping address climate change, reducing sand carting costs to the Adelaide beaches, helping us adapt to rising sea levels, reducing hazardous algal blooms, and making this world a whole lot better for our children. We need historic records to support the practice of democracy, as without the lessons from the past, we are doomed to repeat them. However, we also need these archives to enable us to repeat them and recreate things that we have lost. My question for you tonight is the marine algal bloom South Australia's watershed moment? Is it time we use the lessons past to help us create a healthier, more productive and fairer future? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Lots to think about. If our three speakers would like to join me on the stage.
A couple here. So I think what we've just seen, really, for me, is the the power of good storytelling to change minds and change frames. Would someone like to lead off just talking a bit about storytelling?
I guess it's me.
And its power.
Yeah, I guess that's something that I have thought about a lot. I am doing my PhD in storytelling and the climate crisis and how to tell better stories about ecological change. And I guess one of the things I've found with storytelling is that if you want to change people's minds and behaviours, it's not just a matter of telling them the facts or the bold information. You have to weave the story and get them on other levels as well, emotional levels, also like giving possibilities of how to act and what to do and what worlds could be possible. So that's one of the main takeaways that I've had when talking about, the environment or climate in storytelling, is that facts alone don't make change.
Thank you. You ended it with a story of hope, Faith, and I'm interested in Rebecca Solnit's ideas about the importance of hope in this time and the importance of community in this time. Would you like to reflect on how those two things go together, hope and community?
Okay, well, I woke up this morning to a phone call at 5:30 this morning to an oyster farmer who'd been closed back down again after being recently opened. And he said to me, "The problem is, Faith, I'm running out of hope." And I think this is one of the biggest challenges, is we will only make change if we have hope that there is a better future. And one of the challenges is that we often look at an environment and think that's the best we can have. Whereas this sort of historic work provides us with the option of understanding that we can have a better future. And with climate change, that's one of our biggest challenges, is recognising that there is a positive and better and brighter future if we choose to have it.
Thank you. And a question for Amanda. I was really struck by the way that you locate the riverland globally and within empire and networks of science and communication. Can you project that forward in a way? Do you think that the way the landscape was remade in the riverland according to those ideas, do you think that has an impact on how people see themselves there now? Do you think they would reach for that again?
I think so, and I've been speaking to people about how they think about the Riverland and the Murray-Darling in general, and its place in national history as well as global history, because we need to think about the broader context. We can't just think about, especially when speaking to people upstream, we can't just think about our little patch of the river and how it affects us and our entitlements and our buybacks and all those sorts of things. It needs to be connected, and it needs to be connected with stories of emotion and how it impacts, farmers down in the Coorong as well as all the way at the top. And those sort of broader contexts that are delivered to us through both science and through storytelling are able to deliver those moments of hope, I think. And historians have a strong role to play in allowing those stories to be told to broader audiences and inspiring that kind of change. So I think connecting all those things together is vital in this moment, but probably in all moments, even if we weren't in a watershed moment, as you say, Faith.
Thank you. I've just got one more question and then I'll open it to the audience, so get thinking about what questions you'd like to ask our panellists. I was struck by both Faith and Lauren using the term thin, about thin places. Can you tell us a bit about thin places, either of you? Or both, perhaps?
Well, maybe we have different thoughts about thin places or different views about what that is. For me, I call the Flinders a thin place because, well, in some sense, it's a very thick place, right? Because it contains so much deep history. But I use thin in the sense of you can sort of see through to that history. It's sort of like transparent, and it's like a window through to another place and another world, another way of being. So for me, those tend to be thin places where if you know how to sort of read the rocks or read the environment, you can see through history. what's your view of thin places?
Okay, mine is actually a family term. My grandfather was Bog Irish, and he used to refer to thin places as places where if you poked your finger through, the fairies would fall through. And so it's an Irish term referring to those places where you and the world are closer, that you and the spiritual world are closer together than you are in any other place. And he always believed that the estuaries and the marshes were those thin places.
Wow, so for you it's more of a cultural sort of term. Oh, that's so interesting. I wonder if that's got into my brain from somewhere and stuck there, and then I've reapplied it to geology.
So Beck's going to work with the roving mic, I think, just that one. Who would like to be our first audience question?
They're dumbstruck.
They are dumbstruck. Yes? Please wait. We're recording, so if you wouldn't mind waiting for the microphone.
I've got a pretty big voice. On the ABC, we've got this ad about the 3 causes of the algal bloom, and he seems to be absolutely certain that sometime in the future it's all going to go away. I'd like to know how you see it.
Okay, well, there you are. How he presents those 3 causes vary depending on which ad you listen to. But I can tell you from now almost 2 years of travelling around the world addressing blooms almost identical to this one, that they do all eventually go away. And I think that's always an important thing to realise. But we are getting an awful lot more of them, and they're getting an awful lot worse of this particular group of dinoflagellate. And so, yes, it will go away. I'm not certain it will go away this summer. I am really, really, really hoping it will. There are places where blooms like this last for up to 4 years without break. So I'm hoping we're still going on the 18-month trajectory.
Where are these places?
Gulf of Mexico is one. California has had annual blooms mostly for 21 years, but there's been a break in between, and it has a bloom naturally there. It's a place where they occur naturally anyway. But the Gulf of Mexico has had them. The English Channel has had smaller versions of this bloom. In November, I was in Italy, looking at an area where there'd been a similar related dinoflagellate bloom off the coast in the Adriatic Sea. And interestingly enough, there flows along a highly polluted Po River actually broke that bloom, and that's often the case as riverine flows will break marine blooms. And so, yeah, there is a lot of them. There's areas in Peru that are having issues off the coast there. There is, at the moment, close to 30 Carenia-based and mixotrophic dinoflagellate blooms happening. It's big.
Thank you. So this.
Hang on. No, we're having one question or comment per audience member to start with, so we can get a good coverage.
You can. I just wanted to come back to sort of the idea of hope, I guess, and looking into the past to build the future. And you said something about rebuilding 40% of oyster reefs could help protect us in the future. And I was thinking, like, what does it actually take to rebuild 40% of oyster reefs?
If I trust the 4 NGOs who've priced it for me, $500 million. It also will take us almost 10 years.
Wow, okay.
Do we have another question from the audience?
This is a question for Amanda. I was just wondering what you felt is the future for the riverland, because we're talking about deep time, and I guess on a time scale, the riverland and these orange groves have existed for a very short amount of time. So what do you think of its future going ahead?
One of the interesting things about the history of the Riverland is that you see quite a turnover in how people have pivoted from floods and droughts and those sorts of things from time to time. And we've seen recently with the failure of the grapes in the past couple of years, and people are pulling out vines and planting almonds and planting all sorts of other crops. And there's sort of like circularity in those kinds of things. And I think the future is probably more of going back to those sort of mixed blocks and pivoting to different crops. But it depends on how irrigation buybacks and all those sorts of things change politically over time. And there needs to be a little bit of political courage in terms of they're looking at, redoing the Murray-Darling Basin Plan in the next year or so. So I think those sorts of things are quite dependent. But stories of change and hope drawn from history can really inform how we view these sort of pivots, I suppose. They're not new, and it's not necessarily going to be devastating, but I think there does, as we've seen, there's a bit too much damage done to go back to how things were done in the 1950s and the 1960s, which is where I was studying mostly. I think that's probably the near future. Thank you.
Do we have another questioner? No? Okay. We'll wait for the microphone.
Also to Amanda, do you know how countries who are not colonial settlers deal with the same kind of water problem?
Yes, that's an interesting question, because a lot of the research that I did connected those sort of colonial places. And I found that the Riverland was very closely connected to, obviously, California, but Israel in that time as well. There was a lot of investment coming from America and other places into Israel, irrigation technologies. And when I was looking at like modern day places that produce a lot of citrus, there are a lot of places in South America, and South Africa has a lot of very similar growing conditions. But those in the 1950s and the 1960s, there wasn't so much connection when they're looking for those innovations in terms of irrigation and pest control and diseases and those kinds of things. So from the research that I've done, I didn't see very much because it wasn't being sought out as easily by the people who were writing the documents and the things that I had reference to. But I think that there is probably a really fun project, side project, if anyone has some funding, to look at those sort of especially non-British imperial sort of, and the California-centric worlds, and how they've dealt with those sorts of places. I mean, even Florida's slightly different from California, but I won't go on that tangent.
Thanks. Do we have any more audience questions? No? I've got one maybe for Lauren. Whoever would like to answer it. So it's very interesting thinking about non-human actors in history. And Amanda talked about trees, pests, water and climate. And you had a quite different range of non-human actors, including fossils and microbes, and it's really interesting things that in here in the rock now say. Are there non-human actors that you'd like to explore further? When I'm thinking of non-human actors, I'm often thinking about animals actually, and animals' roles in what I think of as human history. Have you looked at, I know that you have, but have you too looked at animals in that way?
In my book, in the last chapter of my book, I do explore some animals, particularly migratory animals, because my book is about human exploration, or about exploration in general. So I do think about those non-human but animal actors, and especially those that migrate in various different ways. But I think there's something just really fascinating about non-animal beings, because they feel not more other, I don't want to use the word other, but like more beyond us. And so through them, we're able to experience things that are like so far from human senses. So things like rivers, for example, or mountains. I don't know, for me, I really am drawn to those ones because I love thinking very far back through time and deep time and thinking about how things change over those times. So that's why I'm drawn to those ones. I don't know if you have a different answer around.
Well, in my thesis, I had to pull myself back from exploring all of the other than human beings that are present in the sources, because you have salt is such a strong presence in the 1950s and 1960s, trying to figure out how it interacts with plants and the trees, the non-citrus trees, those striking images of dying gum trees in the riverland and beyond during times of drought. And then microbes as well. I think in particularly agricultural settings, it's really interesting to think through the way we think about the barrier between life and death, and the role that microbes play in sort of extending agency of, you know, a plant has agency, we accept that. When it's dead, it's something else. And microbes emerge and they sort of extend the life of that agency and presence. And it's very relevant in agricultural settings because we use compost as quite an integral part of how we develop things. So yeah, I love thinking through history through those more than human lenses, because it gets you to think differently. And that's the thing I love about environmental history generally, is that it gets you to look askance, away from the humans that are so present in the sources anyway, and it gets you a new perspective on those humans and other than humans, and what it can tell you, even philosophically, about how things are and were and could be.
Thank you. Faith, I think you had something to add there. I could just
Yeah, about 10 years ago, Green Adelaide started doing some really interesting stuff about shorebirds. And they ended up having a series of artists and historians doing work around the flyway between shorebirds that stretched all the way from Werribee in Victoria up through the Coorong, up to Roebuck Bay, across China and up to Siberia. And they had this amazing work they did linking cultures of these birds and their influences on the human environment around them. And so in some areas they had their eggs harvested, and in some areas they were hunted, and in other areas they came down here and they were used as indicators of where food could be extracted. And so there were all these cultural connections through time. And I just thought it was beautiful to tie what we would assume were non-connected cultures together via the flight of birds.
All right. It's been a very rich discussion. And if there's last call? No? I'd just like to thank the three of you for really, really interesting and fabulous work. You've all been deep in the landscape, deep in the archives. It's really deep in the salty environments. It's been really, really interesting. I think for some of us it might have shifted our ideas a little bit about thinking about what can be a historical actor, about how we can see the environment that we have such an impact on. So can you join with me in thanking our speakers again? That's a really... and if I might just leave you with Faith's question as you go home. We might think, is the marine algal bloom South Australia's watershed moment? Just ponder that on your way home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy.
I'm amazed by that thing, because I just think it works.
But when you said it...